Hello from the Javi Plantation House, and I'm Charles Biderman. Historically, every major breakthrough in communication technology has created a breakthrough in wealth, health, and well-being. From wheels attached to beasts of burden, to roadways allowing for the Roman army to march and conquer, to using wind power to cross oceans, to the printing press, each one in its own historical time frame created a breakthrough in wealth, health being defined as an increase in available calories per person, and well-being. The Industrial Revolution saw the most dramatic changes. Engines, electricity, telephone, aviation, all that stuff was developed starting in the middle of the 19th century. Great wealth was created. Huge increases in caloric production allowed for an exponential population increase. And in well-being terms, the possibility of government for the people and by the people was created by the Industrial Revolution. Consider that each generation growing up in the middle of a communication breakthrough is defined by what the breakthrough allows for. For example, currently, a revolutionary global communication breakthrough is occurring: social media. The post-millennial generation will consist of everyone born with social media in front of them. My one-word name for this generation is the socials. Because social media really began in the early 2000s, anyone born starting in 2000 is a social. And yes, these youth are still teenagers. But starting about 20 years from now, and certainly by 2040, the socials will be running a much different world from today. Here are a few tidbits in what I believe is highly likely in a world run by those who grew up with social media in front of them. Women and minorities will be running the world by 2040. And yes, for that to happen, racism and sexism will have disappeared. How can I say that? First, the pre-baby boomer generation, those born before they had a television, grew up in a world where racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, all that stuff was not only legal, but conventional wisdom. Everybody believed that. Since the last pre-baby boomers were born in the early 1950s, by 2030, they will be dying off and leaving the stage, so to speak. Second, intermarriage will become much more prevalent as the global gene pool merges. Third, gender and gender preference will become indifferent. In a social media world, every email address is the equal of every other email address, regardless of sex, race, religion, sexual preference, location, whatever. Fourth, women and minorities, believe it or not, have started over 70% of all new businesses since 2000. So add it all up, and add this: historically, groups discriminated against, such as women and minorities today and in the past, when liberated, usually rise to the top. And that's why I predict women and minorities will be running the world starting in about 20 years from now. Socials will also be creating new disruptor technologies to replace inefficient and ineffective government services. Education, particularly the developed skills necessary to participate in the social media world, will generate lots of new apps. New apps will come to the fore that support and enable all of us human beings to live well and stay healthy for as long as possible. So between scientific breakthroughs and well-being advancements, socials will stay much healthier and live lots longer. The current generation, called millennials, are those who came of age around 2000, meaning anyone born between the middle of 1980s and 2000. Millennials came of age benefiting from having video games in front of them. Then, with the development of the internet in the 90s, millennials were the most natural adopters of that technology. And when broadband was developed in the early 2000s, millennials obviously became the leaders in creating what we now call social media. However, millennials economically are a much more distressed generation than the ones before, and in my opinion, the social media generation now growing up. Why? When millennials came of age in 2000, what they faced was a massive dot-com bubble bursting. Many tech companies went broke, and the stock prices of those that survived in aggregate only recently passed their 17-year-ago peak, their early 2000 peak. So in other words, the first economic event experienced by millennials was a market bust, wiping out trillions of dollars. And then within 7 years, not only there was another multi-trillion-dollar market collapse, but also any millennial who'd levered up to buy a house on a nothing-down mortgage lost everything in the housing market collapse. So therefore, based upon how the Great Depression generation never again invested in stocks, I suspect that stock and home ownership by millennials will be much less than that of the baby boomers or the coming social media generation. And even worse for millennials, they grew up in a time when they could borrow all their college expenses from the government, which in reality is an economic disaster for them because the skills learned in college in aggregate will never generate enough income for millennials to live on, let alone to create enough extra cash to pay back their student loans. So the bottom line for millennials, wherever they live and wherever, is that they are risk-averse and debt-burdened and lacking in opportunity in a world run by fairness. And we'll talk about fairness more in a minute. And the long-term solution for millennials, wait for their parents to die so they can inherit the homes and assets they are living off of anyway. And before they were millennials, in terms of growing up under a breakthrough technology, there were the Gen Xers. Gen Xers are those born starting in the late 1970s who grew up with a computer in front of them. The IBM PC was first introduced in 1981, and Apple about the same time. So youth born with computers in front of them benefited mightily in terms of jobs, careers, and huge investment opportunities. And as Gen Xers matured in the 80s, the US and global economies were booming. So that's why anyone with a college degree back then, regardless of what the degree was in demand. And as a result, most Gen Xers had a good life as incomes, equities, and home prices all surged. No surprise then that the generation after the Gen Xers, the millennials, mistakenly believed that it was the college degree that created the possibility of a good life, not rapid economic growth in the society as a whole. And add to that delusion easily obtainable student loans, and unfortunately, in a slow-growing world, expensive college educations will not create enough income in aggregate to pay back those student loans. So therefore, not only are millennials risk-averse, but they are starting their adulthood deep in debt with little opportunity to earn their way to solvency. So going back one further generation was mine, the baby boomers. But I say a baby boomer is someone born with a television set in front of them, not just by year. I was born in 1946, and my family bought an 11-inch TV in 1947, a Dumont. I literally grew up with a TV set. My first TV memories are of Howdy Doody and Milton Berle. So while TV arrived in major metropolitan areas in the late 40s, full nationwide TV service did not happen until the mid-1950s. So therefore, I say that those born as late as 1955 even, who didn't get a TV until later on, are not part of the baby boomer generation, and they're the age group before that. Back in the late 1970s, I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and at the time, I unsuccessfully tried to put together a magazine called Epoch, geared towards baby boomers. At the time, I used various focus groups on the value difference between those born with a TV set and those who are not. The results are fascinating. Us baby boomers learned from TV that all men and women are created equal, that the good guys win, the bad guys lose, and blacks, whites, we're all the same, and the ultimate goal in life is to live happily ever after. However, those born before TV were born when racism, misogyny, and anti-Semitism was legal, commonplace. Everybody believed it, and that was not just in the South where I was, but everywhere. The good guys for those born before TV were family, friends, neighbors. The bad guys, everybody else. There was a recent print story interviewing two communities in central Pennsylvania. One community supported Trump and the other Hillary. What was the difference? Simple. Trump supporters were mostly older, in their 50s and older, and Hillary supporters were mostly younger. So that's why I said before that racism is likely to disappear by 2040. The oldest non-baby boomers were born in the early 50s, are now in their late 60s, and they'll be dying off. Besides TV, baby boomers grew up in a world benefiting from World War II communication breakthroughs. Post-World War II and the Korean War, an interstate highway system was needed for the next war to be able to move tanks and troops from coast to coast, and thank God there wasn't another war. The interstate system created demand for millions of new autos per year, millions of new homes to live in newly accessible suburbs, and created demand for all the furniture and fixtures new homes require. Aviation, when jets, shrunk the world to where any place in the world is reachable within 24 hours today. So as a result of all the wealth created, the stock market rose from a Pearl Harbor WW2 low of just over 100 to over 900 by 1966. So that was a nine-time increase. Great wealth was created while the market rose that 9 times over 25 years. Parenthetically, that compares to a 14-time increase in the market from 1,000 in 1983 to 14,000 in 2007. It's nice to be around when the markets are surging. And also great breakthroughs in health also resulted. The World War II era saw the first antibiotics, namely penicillin, and that, believe it or not, in my opinion, created the possibility of equal rights for women. Prior to penicillin, reportedly 1 in every 10 women died during childbirth. That meant that if a woman had 10 children, she was likely to die, which is probably why statistically more women are born than men. Add to that, birth control pills developed in the 1960s, and between antibiotics and birth control pills, physically being a woman is now no longer more risky than being a man. And that's why I said earlier that by 2040, women and minorities will be running the world. Historically, any group that has been subjugated after being liberated ends up running the show. But even more important than all the breakthroughs in health, to where the average lifespan is now 70 plus years, maybe 80 from about 50 at the start of the 20th century, is that us baby boomers created a world where enough calories are being produced to feed everybody. No starvation, except for the problems created by governments that block the distribution of those calories because they're greedy. The people running them are stealing. But there is enough calories produced. And us TV babies growing up, we believe that we are all created equal and all of us deserve to live happily ever after. And seeing that while we have much excess calories, much of the world is still suffering from calorie insufficiency, also known as starvation. And that is not fair, capital letters, F-A-I-R. It is obviously not fair that people starve daily when the world produces enough calories. That's why, starting with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the late 1960s, fairness has been the prevailing ideology underlying all Western government actions. Fairness means that we need a safety net. Fairness means that we need to create laws where everybody gets what they need. Not only food, education, healthcare, and retirement, but now some say we deserve a yearly stipend from the government. After all, it's only fair, right? Well, the main problem with all that is that Western governments have spent trillions in providing what fairness requires, and governments have promised to spend hundreds of trillions more in the future to meet all the promises made to the current population. Forget the future population. So there are 2 major problems in a world where fairness is the prevailing ideology behind government. First, we cannot afford all the promises made by our governments. There is no way our economies can grow at a rate close to 10% a year in order to grow incomes fast enough to generate enough taxes to fund the hundreds of trillions of dollars equivalent of promised benefits. In simple language, all Western governments essentially are broke. We will not be able to meet our obligations. How are we meeting our obligations now? We're printing money. And newly printed paper money at some point in time soon, 5 years, maybe 10, will no longer be accepted in exchange for goods and services. Second, and equally important, if you eliminate personal risk of failure and you make life fair so people can't fail, you also thereby have to limit the amount of actual risking, and you also actually limit opportunity. Why should you take a risk when your butt is covered by some government program? So no surprise that here in the United States, for the first time in our history, there are less new companies starting up than are shutting down. Why take a risk when you can still get a student loan, live in your parents' basement, or go on disability and get food stamps and welfare? What's missing is opportunity. When the socials take over after Western governments are forced to default on its promises, what will be most important is opportunity, particularly how social media can be used as an opportunity. Here's an example. When an industrial plant shuts down, instead of all the newly unemployed going on the dole and that's it, the facility has to remain open for, say, 2 years and provide free rent, utilities, and most important, lots of bandwidth. In other words, all communities should be looking to create new business incubators in the midst of the destruction of the old industrial base. If governments are no longer financially able to meet their financial promises, the opportunity for social media is limitless. Social media applications will be developed to replace the current helpless and hopeless educational system. Healthcare will shift from dealing with illness to keeping people healthy and well for as long as possible. And as technologies such as 3D printing develop, there will be less and less so-called manufacturing job. Instead of day labor type work where you show up and get paid hourly for doing something, employment will shift to discovering what each of us can do that will make enough of a difference in other people's lives that they will pay for our doing it. Whether it's creating crafts, apps, entertainment, or new ways of living better via social media, the new jobs will be much more satisfying than having to work for a living. And yes, many who read this or see this will think that a social media world will destroy itself as anarchy rules. I disagree. The more effectively we communicate with one another, not only will there be breakthroughs in wealth and health, but also in well-being. Thank you.